Hello, and welcome to The Bridge, where our goal is to connect fans with bands. My name is Brandon, and I'm joined by my co-host, Zach. I'm drinking my latte once again today. Zach, what are you drinking today?
I've got a delicious beer here from the center of Germany, from the Thuringen region. It's called Festbock, which means something like celebratory deer or something like this. But then at the same time, Bock also is a slang term for desire. So it could also mean something like desire to party. There's certainly a fantastic selection of beer here. And you want to know something? It's exciting to go to the beer store because while there are certainly certain brands, um, this beer, for instance, I can only find at a very specific corner store in the city. And so it's always worth your while to sort of pick your way into every nook and cranny and every little tiny shithole store that you see, because you
Okay.
never know what gems you may find, what diamonds in the rough
Maybe
you
I'll send
may
I'll
discover.
send you some jams, and you'll send me some beer.
Okay, yeah, sure. Yeah, it seems like a fair trade-off. There is no Newfie store in Germany, unfortunately. Every province in Canada has at least one, come from away store or some Newfie store for somebody who's terribly homesick and having to work away from Newfoundland, but not in Germany.
No, not in Germany. So you might need some purity sent your way. My dad used to always say, "Good goddamn damn, I want a jam," and that's been like seared into my brain. So whenever even see a jam, I have to say it out loud.
Good goddamn damn, I want a jam. Yeah.
So the album we're talking about today is by the Weather Station, an album called Ignorant. What can you tell me about this band?
Yeah, so the Weather Station are the brainchild of Tamara Lindemann, and this is their fifth release. First album she released was an indie release. It was called All of It Was Mine. She released it independently, and then she has also released another record independently as well. However, I can't recall the name of it, and I'm not sure if it's available on Spotify because though there's only 4 of her albums available on Spotify, I read around a little bit and she has definitely released 5 records. She started off as a very minimalist country folk based artist with bluegrass influence, a lot of finger picking, banjo work, and so on. Since her initial release, however, since her initial release of All of It Was Mine, she has consistently evolved her style to become more folk rock oriented. It is less minimalistic. She introduces more different instruments, introducing stronger guitar chords. There's strong. There's more drums. Like the drum has become the anchor of the band.
Yes, absolutely. I have actually a large comment on that one as we go through. I've noticed that very well. And some readings I did about how she went and wrote this album. I guess I'll mention it now. That she wrote most of these songs for this album, Ignorance, kind of on her own with a piano. And so she worked fundamentally with kind of those built-in drum beats on the piano as she kind of like wrote. And I think that kind of rudimentary beginning shows a lot in the structure of a lot of these songs. I feel like a lot of these songs are built from the drums up.
And to follow up on what I was saying about how with each record she evolves her sound somehow and has been progressing towards this more country rock, folk rock sound. This album is a very large leap, and I think that is part of the reason why the music is so centered around the drum. They have a very strong presence in just about every song, except some of the slower tracks, which are far more stripped down and minimalist, which remind me a little bit more of her earlier work.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. The music is kind of folk in terms of personality and writing, but the music is definitely very meticulously and specifically arranged. And I think that's maybe that jazz influence that you're kind of talking about, and plus with the more broad range of instruments that you'll see on this, where it is folk rock. I think it is fits in that genre. It does spread its wings a little bit.
And just these little things
Yeah.
that give it that jazz influence. Not to mention, there's also it also uses a lot of piano, like you mentioned, and also the saxophone occurs on a couple of tracks.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and so that's where I've developed this idea about it being a very strongly jazz influenced record. And I think if you go back and you listen to even her last album, you'll notice there's a very stark departure from the sound.
Right. That's kind of what the commentary I was hearing about this album. I hadn't really heard about it until you brought it to my attention. But doing a light breezing about what the album kind of was getting reception, I was getting a lot of this is a leap for the band. That this was a new sound that they were kind of engaging with and experimenting with. And a lot of people were enjoying it, I think. You were saying that you had a lot of positive reviews that you had seen. I kind of got the same kind of sentiment, generally positive. I think we'll see how me and you turned out.
We should also note that Tamara Lindemann, she's a very strong lyricist.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this comes out of the singer-songwriter folk tradition that she emerged from.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that there is no other song other than the introductory track, Robber, which places or emphasizes her strength as a songwriter even further, because the track has very ambivalent lyrics, and this record has been hailed as being a record that focuses on the dangers of climate change and the complicated feelings people have about the lifestyle changes that will have to occur, or their conflicted feelings about just this present moment that we're in as far as climate change goes. And it seems like the world's on a bit of a tipping point, especially obviously with the coronavirus. But after the coronavirus is over, there's still a host of problems that we're going to have to address globally as global citizens of the world. And so the lyrics for Robber, you could read them in several ways. They could read as though she's describing a relationship, as if she's describing the climate crisis, or if she's describing inequality that arises because of capitalism.
Right. When I was reading through the lyrics, I kind of landed on the latter.
Okay.
I took this to be a song about the wealthy's paranoia. She takes this approach about never fearing the robber. She's danced with the robber. She's learned to wring from his hand the touch of a lover. She's kind of family within this robber persona, which I believe in this song is kind of the middle to lower class, I think, is kind of the idea. A lot of these companies and wealthy organizations or people always seem to have this paranoia that people are stealing from them and they want to take from them because of what they have. She kind of takes this approach as this third person, which she does in several of these tracks, kind of watching the scenario in front of her. She takes this perspective as not seeing the robber. She doesn't see this robber. He doesn't exist because it's just a idea conjured up by that upper 1% class. There's a good section here that I think expresses both her writing chops and the kind of theory that I'm going with here. You never believed in the robber, but the robber never believed in you. You're two halves of the same piece divided in two. No, the robber don't hate you. He had permission. Permission by words, permission of thanks, permission by laws, permission of banks. And I think that really encompasses her coldness to this wealthy class and their perspective of being robbed. And it's like, no, she doesn't see it that way. She sees it as almost deserved and brought on by all these other things. and she ends the lyrics actually in a very interesting visual that I was very a big fan of.
I agree. I couldn't agree more. I think the ending stanza to this song, the lyrics it's poetry in my opinion.
Absolutely, and to go over it, nobody taught me nothing was mine. If nothing was mine, taking was all there was. Looting at dawn, looting at dusk. Hold open the gates for the want with lust. And this last line, I think, is pure poetry, in which speaks to her ability as a writer. And all I saw was the dust kicked up.
Yeah.
And I can't help but read that and get goosebumps.
I
You know?
agree. This image of the dust being kicked up in the wind, and you sort of there's all these other associations that come along with it, and like you said, yeah, goosebumps. It's a chilling image.
Absolutely. And I think that's one of her strengths as a writer throughout this album, is being able to conjure these images. She doesn't over describe things. I think Rubber might be her best written song on the album, maybe. I don't think she overwrites things a lot, but at certain points she will do great diligence in describing one particular thing in not an overly verbose way, but a very specific slash vague way, which is kind of a paradox. But I'll explain. I'll give more examples of this as we go. But I thought her writing was phenomenal on this track. It really stood out to me as a highlight single of this year. Maybe one of my favorite singles of the year. This is a strong must listen, even if if in the end the album may not be something you're interested in. I think this song, along with following the lyrics, is a strong, highly recommend for me.
Yeah, for 100%. And the reason this album has garnered as much attention as it has is because this track was released as the single leading up to the record's release. It was released in either late September or October, and it was received with universal acclaim.
Right.
And so it's sort of the pioneering song for the album, even though the third track in Tried to Tell You is the most listened to track according to the Spotify statistics anyways.
I also noticed that.
Yeah, however, this was the breakout moment for this album. And I also forgot to mention in the beginning, and just as a short aside, she's actually created music video for each song on this record.
Okay. I
Which
was when I was listening to this album, I was kind of like typing in, and a video would pop up, and I'd watch the one of them. So I watched Robber, and then I typed in another one, another video came up, and I was like, okay, I watched Atlantic, which is the second track, and then Try to Tell You. I typed it in, that popped up, and I watched Tried to Tell You, and I was like, wow, all the singles are at the beginning, beginning of this album. I didn't continue that trend with all of them, but you're saying that there's a video for every single song here?
they're not the most elaborate videos.
No.
Robert the most elaborate for sure. However, yeah, she created somewhat of a movie, I guess, and if you want to watch the music videos instead of watching it on Spotify, I would maybe recommend it because I think the visual communicates the mood and atmosphere of the album.
I actually really enjoyed it. I didn't catch that. I did somewhat notice that every time I searched one up, there's a video for it, but I didn't conclude that there was one for every song. I actually really like that. I'll probably after this review probably go and watch them all in order. I think I would enjoy that.
Yeah, so just to follow up on some of your comments about the lyrics, it's interesting that you perceived the lyrics or read the lyrics from a top-down position, from corporations sort of looking down and feeling as though they've been robbed. Because I looked at it from a down-up perspective, as if it was a worker or a member of the proletariat that was speaking against the corporations and the capitalist system and this late stage capitalism that we find ourselves in, and how
Sure.
it's not working. And whether or not we are right or wrong doesn't matter. I think what's important is that her lyrics are written in such a way that it both perspectives work.
Right. The reason I took my perspective is because she comes from this third person perspective, right? And so she talks about the robber in this way where the robber doesn't hate you, right? And I felt like this was more commenting on the lower class being the robber, being deemed or classified as a robber by maybe media or these organizations. And she's kind of like counterpointing, is like, no, you know, I don't see a robber, and it's not that these people hate you or have militia against you. Is that, again, your point about the capitalist scenario? They're in a situation where they need to fight to survive. Fight to against the oppression and scenarios that they find themselves. So it's two sides of the same coin. I just kind of took it from the top down. That the organizations were kind of spreading the idea of a robber and kind of like casting dispersions on the people just because of the way that she talks about the robber and how the perspective she takes on it.
Well, I think more generally, what she's speaking to is something that all of us are guilty of, or at least the spirit of the times is guilty of, and it is embodied in these final lyrics. If nothing was mine, then taking was all there was. Looting at dawn, looting at dusk. Hold open the gates for want of lust. There's this sense of greed, and I think it
Mhm.
exists on both sides.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. But I think she kind of gets this the kind of coldness and callousness that she kind of delivers her singing in, which I'll talk about a little bit as we go through.
Yeah.
I think kind of disperses this feeling of she doesn't care about that upper class. So there's kind of like this relevance that this is deserved, is kind of how I took that.
Mm-hmm.
Shocks about the lust and as you were saying, and it kicks up this greed and ravidness that's there, but it kind of comes off feeling like a endorsement of riot is the language of the unheard. So it's I kind of felt like I'm turning a blind eye to this, as the Black Lives Matter, riot, kind of turn a black eye to some of the violence because you understand the emotional and strength of the sentiment that is riling people up, and sometimes they do certain things that you might point a finger at and say shouldn't do that, that's a bit much or whatever, but she turns a blind eye to it, and as I have and as other people have, to certain extremes in this kind of like field, she almost kind of envisions them as people fighting for their freedoms and for their rights, and based on the permissions again that she deems that they've given. But yeah, how did you find the instrumentals on the track?
Yeah, so the instrumentals, it's the only song, I think, I could be wrong, but it makes a very strong statement as the introductory song that it has a introduction that lasts for an entire minute, 55 seconds, I believe.
Yes.
And it introduces itself, or it contains a saxophone, piano, and drums. These are the three main core instruments, and the saxophone and the piano, they have this beautiful moment throughout the song where they hit their keys at the same time. And also on this track, there's that rim shot that I spoke of earlier that is very typical for jazz orientated drums. And that rim shot really, it has that high pitch, it hits really quick, and again, it brings a sense of immediacy.
Right. There's a point in the song that I think really emphasizes kind of what you're saying. The vocals hit. They're cold, measured, very haunting delivery. She performs like a judging ghost on this song, like an angel passing judgment or just disappointed. It's kind of like the vocal delivery, and I think this, to your point, there's a part of the song where I took a lot of joy in. This is like maybe my favorite instrumental song, part of the song, right before the breakdown. and it builds up into the breakdown. And she's singing, "Turn your gaze from the window's light, turn your attention to this sharp knife." And as soon as she says that, the strings all ascend to this sharp sting, and the breakdown begins.
A violin kicks in at that point.
Right. And it's just like this chilling development into this dance of instruments filling the air, and it's like kind of like all around you. Like there's a structure here, but it's almost shrouded. It almost feels chaotic and like random and sporadic, but you pay attention, there is a structure going on with the instruments as this climax and breakdown goes on, and then she returns to the song again, to the lyrics rather. So I really enjoyed this song. Robber was a clear highlight for me. I think this might be one of my favorite songs of the year so far. I definitely recommend, at the very least, listening to this song.
Yeah, this song, as you were saying about the musical arrangements, it has this sort of additive effect. As the verses build, there's more instruments are added. They add a guitar, they add a violin, and then the arrangements actually start to change. And it never starts to repeat itself, but then somehow it sounds very familiar, and then towards the end it has this great build, and a fantastic song, perhaps, like you said, one of the best single releases of the year.
Mm-hmm. Let's move on to the next song. I think we've beaten this one to death.
Yeah.
I wanted to talk about Atlantic a little bit, because I think there's some lyrics here as well that kind of express more of kind of how I feel her writing is really interesting. It's hard for me lyrically. It's hard for me not to generalize music during this time to be COVID related, but the song seems to be about escaping to the Atlantic, to all its beauty, and she paints a gorgeous picture. And in the half-life, this is lyrics, sorry. In the half-life, soft wind on my skin, pink clouds massing on the cliffs, thinking, how can I touch this? How can I touch the softest petal, softest stem, softest leaf, bending green in my palm? And and most of the other lyrics on this song are pretty kind of like straightforward. There's not like a lot of super layer to it. Maybe if you want to dig into it, you can probably pull it apart. But I find here, she takes one stanza to like really kind of like get descriptive with this description of like the softest petal or the pink clouds massing on the cliffs. She does a great job, especially having grown up in the Atlantic myself, as yourself. These are very images I can easily conjure and fill the spaces in. You know, I can see myself on a grassy knoll, just encompassing all of these descriptors that she's giving, and the peace and tranquility that comes along with it. So I think her strength, and this will come up as we go, is her ability to talk about things, maybe some cliche topics or very common topics, but she avoids cliches throughout her writing. And to avoid those cliches, she takes interesting approaches, sometimes from a third person, sometimes usually from her own perspective, but sometimes she applies things to other people in the narrative. But her ability to like talk about things without getting so cliche and into common phrases, makes her writing unique sometimes, how she talks about things. I was really interested in the song just because of the lyricism, and her voice is still interesting, and the instrumentals are still really compelling to me. She has another point here where she talks about commenting on the headlines and getting over all the dying off her mind. Can I just cover my eyes? And that's kind of where I thought maybe the COVID relation was. But, if I listen to the song in an era where COVID is not prevalent, I still see the song having a lot of merit. A lot of the headlines and all the news is really a lot of negative news, a lot of death, a lot of, that kind of swirling up. And I think she comments kind of how she's getting caught up in this a little bit and she needs to escape. But go ahead. How did you feel about the song?
Well, to follow up with what you're saying, and I agree, as a Canadian, and when I dove into the lyrics, and I made special note of this on the track Separated, which is the 6th track on the album, there's a certain wildness to her lyricism, in the sense that she evokes the wild aesthetic of the Canadian landscape and Canadian geography. She really uses the ocean, the mountains, the open space, the pastoral landscape that fills out so much of Canada, and which so many people from Canada, live in. A lot of people in Canada live in towns. I think it's like 40% or 50% of Canadians live in small towns.
Did you find that this song made you homesick, or at least this album maybe?
No, it didn't make me homesick because as much as people can romanticize about the Canadian landscape and everything, I find it to be almost like a prison, because everyone is so far apart. It's like you're sort of trapped in this one location, and then the next person is so far away. However, I will admit that, yeah, it made me feel fondly, or it made me think fondly of Canada, the nice visuals I have of the place. And it was great to finally read lyrics and hear a voice out of Canada that is not sort of centered on the urban life that is so, like, lyrics about Drake that come from Drake singing about the Six. And I can remember when I first moved abroad, people asked me if I was from the Six, and I was just, oh man, it was heartbreaking. It was like, oh god, no, really, this is what you think of Canada? It's just the Six, but on an international stage, this is what people have in mind. They think Canada is Montreal and Toronto.
Yeah, yeah.
This album speaks more widely to what Canada is as a province, not as a province, as a country, and it can be found in the aesthetic of her lyricism.
Right.
And I do want to say something about this song specifically, not just generally about her lyricism. This track for me is indicative of what becomes a problem for me on the album, especially after listening to her previous records, where her voice was in the foreground and you could hear the lyrics very clearly. I find this album it's difficult to hear what she's saying because she's changed her singing style a little bit, and the tracks are louder. It's not based on this finger picking guitar style. Drums are louder, there's more cymbals and so on. And so I find that her voice and the beauty of her lyricism gets lost in this musical shift that the band is making.
Okay. This is the song where I commented on her voice always staying measured. There's never a point where she explodes vocally. Instead, the instrumentation will swell and crescendo in certain climactic parts, and that kind of delivers the emphasis that her voice, kind of pulls back from. And it kind of still creates that grand moment, which I really enjoyed. I also called this a little shoegazy because of the same qualities that you just gave, not in sort of the reverb and drowning guitars that you hear in Loveless or My Bloody Valentine, but more in the sense that, like you're saying, her voice is kind of a little behind the mix.
That's a good note. That's a good note, actually, because I mentioned, yeah, her voice. It's almost like she's looking down at the stage when she's singing. Like her voice sounds like a whisper.
Right. I didn't mind that. You kind of commented on how it kind of hides her lyricism stuff, and that's true. I don't think she's super hard to hear. This is not. I don't think you mean to say that she's super hard to hear, but maybe a little more difficult in comparison to her other work, and because the instruments are a little more in the foreground. But I think they work together really well. Again, how sometimes the instrumentation will do something so her voice doesn't have to, and I don't think her voice can't. I think this is a very conscious decision of how she wanted it to sound and how her voice to mix with the music. So I did have the similar comment, but I wasn't such a critique of it.
Well, I think maybe I went back and listened to some of her earlier work, and so I'm coming from that perspective a little bit, where her
Sure.
voice very much in the front, and you could hear the lyrics far better. And yeah, her singing style, she's changed it to accommodate this new jazz arrangement that the band is experimenting with.
Sure.
So she's singing in, it's either a lower tone or she's going really high. There's no in between, and
In her older work or this current work?
no, in this current work, in some tracks she goes really high, like the last track, for instance, Subdivisions. I wouldn't say it's soaring, but she hits a higher register. It's not, and then on a track like Atlantic or Robber, it's lower. It's almost like she's registering almost the same tone as the drums.
Yeah, I'll talk to you a little bit more about that as you go through. Let's talk about Tried to Tell You, because I
Yeah.
was also enjoyed this one. I'm impressed with the way she writes, even though it's like a love song. She does great not to lean on cliches again in this one. She takes a third person perspective, describing this other person. She's a captivating writer, and she kind of and that writing really lifts up the album a lot. It makes it more engaging to listen to, or just to read along with. I find the albums do a lot of great work here.
To follow up on what you're saying, it's very much an album that you would read along to with
Mhm.
as far as the lyrics go, because listening on its own, and I've listened to the record a couple times now, several times now, and it's still hard for me to pick out the lyrics without having the lyrics in front of me. Once I have the lyrics in front of me, yeah, sure, it's fine, and I enjoy the songs more when I can see the complexity of the lyrics and so on.
Yeah, that's kind of what I'm commenting there is when because I also did the same. I do this with any album though, regardless of how clear the vocals are. I generally read along with the lyrics sometimes with certain albums.
Yeah.
It's not a comment on their clarity or anything, but it's just more how I prefer to do it. I watch Netflix with subtitles on, I'm one of those people. So I also got more joy while reading the lyrics as I was listening, through. If you're not that type of person who doesn't like really doing that, well, consider it here because I think a lot of the writing is pretty compelling. Instrumentally, the vocal melody on this track is very unique, and I find her voice very captivating on the song. I find it very hard to describe exactly what she's doing here. I think you're just going to have to listen to it to hear it yourself. But I made a comment here, and I think this kind of speaks to kind of what you were saying about the ranges and how I kind of want to comment on that a little bit. She does this thing I start to refer to as reverse speed. Her voice decibels will like refuse to go above a certain level, or else the bus is going to explode. She just refuses to go above a certain point.
But
So she pushes it absolutely, and that's kind of what I really like. Is that she's got this whisper sing, and when she goes into her upper range, which I wouldn't say is a high range. It's like within this cold, calculating, singing style that she has, but it's almost like she's full of emotions, and she wants to sing higher. She wants to soar, but she won't let herself. And so her voice carries this characteristic of like bursting at the seams. She won't let herself sing higher, but like all the emotion is there that she just almost could, and she just won't. Speed vocals, almost like she just won't go above this decimal, but she still pushes this emotional performance out of her vocals anyway.
I think, yeah, she doesn't soar super high,
No.
but she certainly aims towards higher notes, but her voice is simply not a loud voice.
Mm-hmm.
And it gives this sense that, yeah, she's like someone who's holding back her emotions, but she feels very deeply. And
Right.
so her voice is hitting this higher register, but the volume of her voice just won't let her push beyond where it is her voice currently is on this record.
Yeah.
That is not necessarily a bad thing.
No.
Right?
I
But
think it's actually really compelling, and I really like it.
and
Instead of going to this upper register, sometimes her voice will crack,
yeah,
and it'll go into like this whisper kind of range, and I find it so compelling and such a great vocal performance. I honestly.
And on a track like this, I noticed there's less cymbals, there's less higher notes coming from the other instruments,
Hmm.
and so her voice is able to stand out a little bit more because the instrumentation is not so loud. And on some of the slower tracks, most notably the last track, I really enjoy Subdivisions. Her voice again sort of takes the lead a little bit. It reclaims its old position from older albums, and I think she has a great voice, like you have been saying. And so part of my problem with the album is that sometimes her voice gets drowned in the instrumentation, but doesn't happen on this track. So
Sure. This also a song I kind of mentioned when I was writing my notes. I like how smooth the track is in terms of the instrumentals, and the arrangements are very compelling. And a lot of these songs are structured in such a way that it's a build, and then there's a explosion near the end. It's kind of a similar format, kind of as you go through some of these songs, while kind of the drums will introduce and stay rampant throughout. And I started getting a little hyper focused on the drums a little bit in my listening because of how prevalent and how core they were to these songs. And this is kind of around the area of my listening where I kind of started to notice that a little bit. But let's move on to Parking Lot.
Parking Lot, I thought it was one of my more favorite lyrical tracks on the album. She uses this metaphor of a bird to describe her sensitivity, and I had this image of her sitting in a parking lot before a show and just being too overcome with emotion to be able to go in and perform the show. And she describes this bird that she sees sitting on the roof at the beginning of the song, and then that metaphor goes away as the song progresses, but then she returns to it at the end. It's sort of like the closing image of the song.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought, yeah, lyrically, it was one of the more cohesive tracks on the album. And then I also liked the piano arrangement on the song. It brought me back to Robber a little bit.
Right. There was this image where she kind of talks about a ceiling, and I think she kind of shows this emotional reaction to the freedom this bird has. And then she also talks about in the chorus, is it all right if I don't want to sing tonight? I know you're tired of seeing tears in my eyes, but are there not good reasons to cry? I swear I'm all right. Maybe you could just let it slide. And she seems to have like this emotional reaction to the bird just singing freely, as it wants, wherever in the sky and clouds or on top of this building in the parking lot. So yeah, I agree with you. It's a pretty interesting song. I again noted how she talks about interesting ideas, but avoids cliches when she does it, so that she's able to capture imagery and ideas a lot better.
Yeah, she is essentially drawing a comparison between her and the bird, her as a singer and the bird as, like a singing bird, like a chirping bird. But she doesn't make it cliche the way that she writes the lyrics. However, as you pointed out, she talks about how how the bird is free to fly or sing however it wants, and then at the same time it makes her be like, I just don't want to sing tonight. Like I'm doing something that I don't want to do, and
Right.
it's like she has this feeling of not being in control of her own artistic freedom. Yeah, great song.
Yeah, I think the lyrically is pretty interesting. Instrumentally, piano and string accompaniment come in and out when they're needed. I kind of get in the idea of the music at this point in the album. You get the driving drums, accompanying instrumentation, either strings, brass, piano, something here, something there. It'll peak, it'll build and peak and climax, and the songwriting brings it over to the next step when some of the songwriting conventions get a little familiar.
Yeah, I would say that the strength of this band is in the songwriting. And
Mhm.
so as the album progresses, it suffers a little bit from the curse of placing one of the best tracks, perhaps the best song on the album at the very beginning,
Hmm.
because then everything sort of slowly, even though good, goes downhill from there.
Yeah, in fact, it's the next song, "Lost," that I think is the weakest track on the album.
Uh-huh,
Um,
okay.
Mostly because I think her writing is really bad on this track. In comparison to how well she writes on these other tracks, this feels like this faux deep. It's just not really up to the standard she's set for herself. She's got like a lot of like straightforward kind of commentary. The light shines through my window. It's just the creativeness and the avoidance of cliches that she's been doing really seems to like disappear on this song. And it's got back to some of the cliches, and it's really kind of like high school level writing. I really didn't understand how her writing dipped so low on the song.
So I didn't pay so much close attention to the lyricism on this song because whereas I was just mentioning, and we were both mentioning how the instrumentation becomes a little bit predictable, maybe the
Mm-hmm.
arrangements, like you know what's coming. I would say starts to become a little slim on ideas. This
Mm-hmm.
song changes it up a little bit. It's the first song since Robber that we get a saxophone again, which for me was one of the key jazzy elements of this record, which just sort of, unfortunately, speaking about the record as a whole, becomes forgotten. However, it reoccurs again on Loss, and they also incorporate a synthesizer or a soundboard there, which meshes well with what it is they're doing with the keyboard.
Right.
And I thought it was just a nice sort of modern electronic touch on what is otherwise a jazzy album, and it helped keep things fresh musically for me.
I thought they didn't do enough instrumental in this. I was a little fatigued on this track. Again, the lyrics didn't capture me, so I was a little more critical of the instrumentation. That driving drum as the core, I was hyper focused on it at this point, and I'm getting a little annoyed by this kind of like drum canvas that kind of took away some of the excitement of these later tracks because I knew it was coming. I knew it existed, and I kind of had an idea of the instrumentals that were coming towards me. I enjoyed the piano melody on this track. It's probably my highlight. It's very dreamy and lovely. But
Mhm.
overall, I thought it was on the weaker side from what she's been delivering up to this point. Maybe not bad in a vacuum, but in terms of the track list, I thought this was a lull.
Okay, yeah, for me to mention or bring up what you were saying again, it was almost one of the more shoegazy tracks on the album.
Okay.
Anyways, going on to Separated.
Back on point with the lyrics on this track really makes Lost stand out as a weird outlier. Even like going back to this one. Again, her ability to take the song topic of a dying relationship and make it sound novel and new was really compelling to me. So this one I thought started differently. It's got the swirling of plucked strings, angelic crescendo from the horns and the strings. Um, at this point in the album, I'm still enjoying the entirety of what's happening here. There's focus. Like to see some more moments where the music would step in and take the main event a little bit more. Lyrically and vocally, she carries the album, but I'm starting to get a little tired of the arrangement, mostly with kind of the bubble the album gets in with the drum as the foundation. It's kind of put them in kind of like a little box by this point in the album.
Yeah, I agree, and that's why I liked Lost, because I thought, okay, we're getting some sax here. We're gonna start switching it up a little bit, and I would agree that if Separated wasn't such a strong lyrical track, that it would mark the descent in quality of the album.
Right.
Because after Separated, for me, the album yeah, becomes a little bit boring.
Hmm.
But let's focus on Separated for a bit before I get into my reservations about the rest of the album. This is, in my opinion, and like you mentioned, one of the stronger lyrical tracks on the record.
Mhm.
And you said it was about a relationship, or that's how you perceived it. I thought it was not even necessarily a relationship, you know? It was just two people who couldn't see eye to eye, who couldn't form a meeting of the minds, which seems so common today in our present society, and just describing what that experience is like and how sycophantic it can be. Just how cruel people can be when you don't agree with their opinion, or you have a difference of opinion. And I think she grounds this very well in, again, this wild Canadian aesthetic of her lyricism. And I'm just going to read a couple of lyrics here. I bore it by feel, in my stupid desire to heal every rift, every cut I feel, as though I wield some power here. I lay my hands over all your fear, this gushing, running river here, that spills over these plains, soaking in all this rain. And as a Canadian, and I'm sure as a citizen of the world, there's so much stark and strong imagery in what it is she's describing, and yet it's still very clear what it is she's saying, you know?
Right, right. Absolutely. That's a beautiful little stanza she's written here, and she has plenty of them on this album.
Yeah.
Well worth looking into and reading. I think you're probably right. The reason I came away with the relationship, because one of the lines in the chorus struck me as very relatable. It's "You've committed to this wall we sleep against," and I had this image of two people sleeping in a bed, and this unspoken kind of tension when one of them is facing towards the wall and kind of separating themselves from the kind of the intimacy that would be with sleeping together.
Yeah.
uh, that's kind of where I kind of pulled this relationship kind of topic, but I think you're probably right with more the grander scales to it. And I think that this was maybe just kind of scripture to help get that feeling across.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure at some time in everybody's life you've been lid down in bed with somebody but never felt further apart from anybody else in the entire world.
Hmm.
And you, yeah, can draw inspiration from that and place it in a different context, you know?
Right.
And
Separate is another one of those songs where I think her vocal performance is really good. The return of those speed vocals that I was talking about earlier, where she struggles not struggles, but she gives this feeling of struggle in her vocal performance where she won't go over that certain decimal point, but she still like oozes the emotional intensity behind it.
yeah. I think this song would have benefited a little bit if it was, and it reminded me of her, not her first album, but reminded me of how this girl has formed her sound, has formed this band based on a very minimalistic approach. Because as the album goes on, and especially this is a great example, the music becomes a little bit stripped down. Wouldn't you agree?
Yes, "Where," which is the next song, is a good example of that. Um, I probably feel "Where" is a better loss in terms of the tracks. I thought this one opened a little better. It's a welcome change of pace with the compilation of the music. The piano and drum kind of take turns. They go back and forth. You'll get a little bit of piano and a little bit of drum will come in, and the drum isn't like over dominating the track like it is on some of these other songs on the album. And it kind of like takes turns with some of the other instruments, and I enjoyed that in this section. It'll occasionally stop, and horns and piano will fill small spaces until the chorus. Then the chorus comes in, the drums will come in, gives it some energy. I enjoyed the structure of the song a lot better than some of the other ones. And I thought this was a welcome change of pace in the late end, but there was still a little too much of some of the other structure ideas in general. But I thought Where was a good change of pace. I wish it was a little earlier in the track list. I wish it was in that Lost spot. And again, I wasn't big on Lost, but I feel like this was kind of how you were describing Lost, but for me I found it in Where.
Well, after Separated and until Subdivisions, even though Subdivisions it makes no sense for me, but after Separated, the album sort of dips in tempo and it becomes a little bit boring for me. The tracks don't bounce from one to the other very well. Because they sound so similar. And while it makes sense on the B side of the record, and the record has sort of been working up to this slower pace by starting out so strong, it begins to wear on me, especially with Wear and Trust, and I'm just it's where my listening begins to grind to a halt.
For songs that are built on pace and pacing of the instrumentals so much, I thought that this album was paced a little weird. I thought these songs like Wear and Trust and the slower tempo songs probably could have benefited from being somewhere else in the track listing to really pop them a little more or add a little bit more variety as the album was going on. It did kind of feel like they tossed them at the end, and it kind of hurts them being right next to each other, I thought. Because Trust is a very similar kind of song, lyrically about divorce. Well, at least that's kind of how I perceive it. There's probably a lot of different layers you can pull from a lot of these songs when you're reading through. But I kind of got the idea of a divorce, or at least that's the metaphor she's working within. Again, I felt like this was a weird pacing. It could have worked better in the middle. It's a piano-focused track. Much appreciated to hear that in the track list. Really enjoyed more the space and the minimalism, and really just kind of like the sparseness of the drums, which I was getting tired of at this point. It does a lot to make it sound new. It is a 5-minute song. It's kind of a trudge to get through in the late part of the album, but it does sound a little different. I just wish the album was paced a little better and formatted a little better.
I think what you're saying about the pacing certainly becomes abundantly clear when you get to this section of the album. There's these 3 songs, Where, Trust, and Heart, that just on repeated listens, I'm skipping over these songs, you know? And
Right.
there's not really, other than Robber, a standout track on this record. Not that that's necessarily a bad thing, because some records work as like a cohesive piece,
Right.
almost like a concept piece, I guess, you
I
know? And
didn't
this
quite
is
get that here, though.
somewhat of neither did I.
Yeah, I thought maybe Wear and Trust did a little bit to alleviate my fatigue with the album, or temper it, but it really was kind of too little too late by that point. And Heart ended up being a lull for me as well. Really hard to really care about it.
What did you think about the last track, Subdivisions, the concluding track of the album?
I lyrically I enjoyed the song. I did still think it kind of fit a little bit into that little pocket. There's more piano, and I like her vocal performance. It just kind of feels a little bit in the pocket.
See, this song, it's one of my favorite vocal performances on the album. I don't know what it is. Her voice just it sounds so tender. It really almost breaks that glass ceiling you and me were speaking of earlier.
Mm-hmm.
And also, I don't know if this has anything to do with it, but she introduces a little bit of steel guitar in the background on this song, and it conjures those country folk sounds and that aesthetic that maybe, for me, it plays into her voice so well. And I think maybe this transition into a jazz rock aesthetic was a bit of a failed experiment, in the
Okay.
sense that her voice doesn't play into it so well. And if you listen to her earlier music, I think it becomes quite obvious that she's changing her singing style a little bit.
Sure. I don't have that perspective because I hadn't really listened to her earlier work.
I would just say, I think a lot of the other tracks that maybe we weren't so pleased with would have benefited if they would have went deeper into this jazz rock aesthetic. You like use the saxophone. You open up the album with this strong combination of sax and piano,
Mhm.
and then the sax just sort of fades away. Like I missed the saxophone as the album goes on.
Right. The album starts off really strong instrumentally as well. A lot of the ideas are really unique, and even throughout the album, I think the instrumental ideas on Robber are unique within the album. Nonetheless, their sound as a whole discography. But in the end, how would you concisely describe this album and your feelings with it?
I would describe this album as someone who has dived a little deeper into the Weather Station's discography. I would describe this album, even though it has so much critical reception and so on, as an artist in transition, as an artist taking a leap of faith, as an artist taking a step into new territory.
Do you like where she's going, or do you think she should turn around?
No, I think I like where she's going, and I think it's quite obvious as soon as you listen to Robber, like this woman has captured a sound. She has, she's one of the best lyricists I've heard in contemporary music,
Mhm.
honestly, and lately. But she just needs to. I think there was a little bit of holding back, maybe. Like she could have went to the steel guitar. She could have went to the saxophone more. She could
Mhm.
have. She just wasn't there yet to have the confidence to combine all the influences that she has.
Right.
And so there's once we get to the second half of this album, the deeper B sides wear thin.
Right. I think I would agree. This is an album I think that is got a lot of potential. There's a lot of like really strong tracks here. Tried to tell you Atlantic, Robber, Parking Lot. Usually the first four, I would generally say. Even separated, I think I would include them there. I think it does wear thin on ideas. Kind of runs out near the end. Her writing is good, a little bit inconsistent on some tracks, but mostly good. I enjoy what I heard here. I liked her voice a lot. I didn't really have your comment on the voice. I don't have that perspective of her previous voice. I like what she was doing with her voice. I didn't mind where it was in the mix. I kind of enjoyed it. I thought it added to the overall feel of the album. But I did feel like they kind of didn't have the ideas to fill an album when it came to this new direction. And I think in the end, it kind of damages a little bit of the overall presentation, even though there is like some real soaring highs on here.
And to your point that never occurred to me, the album just has a pacing problem because, like we were saying, the idea is a little bit thin as the record goes on, and it didn't do a good job of spreading out its best tracks throughout the record.
Hmm.
Most of the best tracks really come on that A side.
Hmm.
However, I do really stand behind the concluding track subdivisions. I thought it was a
Sure.
beautiful vocal performance to close the album.
Probably a little bit of a diamond in the rough of the late this B side, we'll say.
Yeah.
In terms of toe in tracks, I think it's obvious. I'm going to go with Robber. I think
Yeah.
that's a fantastic one. I would even say "Tried to Tell You" is also great. Probably somewhere in between those two songs. I would recommend.
Tried to Tell You is the biggest single on the record. It came to a surprise to me because Robber is such a great track, man. Like,
Exactly. I would say "Robber" is the best track on the album.
yeah, for sure. And
Right.
yeah, and the record suffers from it in a little bit, you know. Like there's this track or there's this line at the end of Martin Scorsese's Raging Bull, and Robert De Niro speaking at the end of the movie, and he says, "It's like this peak you reach, and then it's all downhill from there." And the album really starts at the peak, and then, although it's good, and I don't want to sound too negative, it does slowly make its way downhill as the album progresses.
Right. So what would you rate this album?
You know, it's my first inclination is to say a 6. However, the songwriting is just so strong that I
Mhm.
think if you're somebody who sits down and reads the lyrics along with the album and maybe checks out some of the YouTube videos like I mentioned earlier, the album really lifts itself up to a 7, and it's but at this it's a work in progress in my mind, and it's also an album that I think becomes better the more you listen to it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I think I'm gonna settle on a 7, but it just makes it there. Like, I don't want to do these in between scores like 6.5, but
Right.
this
That's kind
album
of.
this album is definitely one of those albums that warrants this in between score.
And who would you recommend this to?
I would recommend it to people who like folk rock music for sure, because it's got such a strong lyrical thrust. People who are country music fans, I would say give it a crack, because even if this record is not for you, a lot of her discography, the Weather Station discography, may appeal to you. And yeah, as a Canadian, when I traveled a little bit in Canada and worked in different provinces, it was a little bit shocking to me to see how popular country music was. And I think as Canadians, we need to get behind our own artists a little bit more. And yeah.
My score evolved as I listened to this album. Initially, out of the gate, I listened to Robert, and I was like, "Man, this is going to be like a 9." This
Yeah.
album is like blowing me away, and like even going into Atlantic and tried to tell you, I was still on that train. I was like, "This is a solid 9. This is a great album." Like maybe even a 10 if this keeps going. But by the time like Lost comes around and the later tracks, like it really starts chipping away, and it kind of came an 8 to me. And then I was like, is it a 7? It's an incomplete package. And there are parts of this album that are so strong, and then there's other parts of this album that are to be desired. And so it ends up playing it down to like the 7 range, where like I'm averaging songs that are 5s and that songs that are 9s.
Yeah.
And it kind of ends up in that 7 range. The first half of this album is a strong 9, in my opinion. We're up to, I'll even get the first 6 tracks, I'll say. It's a strong 9 for me. After that, even though I did like some of the songs, it just kind of pulls away. I get kind of fatigued with the structure of the songs, especially with the drum. I became hyper focused on that at one point. In terms of who I'd recommend this to, I think people who are very interested in female vocalists. I think she has a very interesting perspective and angle. I think there's a lot of performances on this album in terms of her vocals. They're very strong, and I think are worth listening to. Folk listeners, obviously, I think this is a definite check into. Canadian, you want to support local artists. I think it's also great. People who kind of want to explore a little bit outside their range for something that's a little different. I think this album, at least in its ideas, are novel for them and maybe novel for a lot of listeners, even though it does fatigue. By the end of it, the general idea on the album, I think, is still good, is still compelling, and probably better and more to come. I can see the Weather Station crafting their magnum opus with this idea, but further in the line with some more learning and more crafting and a little more editing around the rough spots.
Well, like you were just saying, yeah, like the band is just growing, and they're only going to evolve from here. They're not a band that stays static for long, and so yeah, maybe a low 7 is a bit of tough love, but it's an excellent record. It really is, but it just has some really weak points, and for that reason drags the score down.
Right, some
But
glaring issues that really kind of like take what is a great idea and these great songs and kind of muddies them a little bit in the grand scheme of it. I'm a stronger 7. I'm a more confident 7 than you, I'd say. Leaning a little bit towards the 8 range. But yeah, I think 7 is probably a respectable and appropriate scoring for this.
Yeah, I mean, on repeated listens, I couldn't listen to the record from front to back, so for that reason, there's no way I can give it an 8. But like we mentioned earlier, this record is making waves in Europe, in Canada, in North America, in the UK, and so we are just one opinion. Many people are rating it higher than we have. So it is certainly worth your while to go check out. And
Right.
I support the band. I
Mhm.
support the band.
I'm excited to see what comes next because I think it could be a real groundbreaking album if they can really pull all the pieces together with the effort and the singing and the songwriting on this album and just tighten it up a bit. This could be really something special. And
Yeah.
not that this isn't special. This is like this is a eureka moment, I think. I think this is the right way to go. It just needs to, kind of figure it out a little bit more.
Yeah. Yeah, so that's Ignorance.
Yeah, next week we'll be back with another album. There's a few ideas up in the air, so I'm not going to tease anything specifically, but I'm looking forward to finding something nice to listen to us for next week.
Well, I've had my eyes on the horizon, and I was wondering if you have had your eyes on the horizon also, because one of your favorite bands, or one of who I believe to be your favorite bands, have a new release coming up at the end of next month. Are you well aware of this?
No, I'm not aware of this.
Okay,
Curious what you're talking about.
so you know Juju have a new album
Oh,
called A Bottle of Rum,
oh, that's exciting.
and it's a duet album. Every song on the album features a guest artist.
Okay, okay,
I would encourage you to go listen to the single they have released. It's very good.
okay. We might just end up reviewing that. I've been short-sighted. I've been looking week to week when it comes to these album reviews. A few weeks ahead, maybe for some of them that have caught my attention, but I'm generally ignorant to what we're going to see in T2, T3, and T4 of this year. So going into summer, I should expect a lot, but we'll see.
Yeah, well, I'm very excited for this Juju record because those guys, they always put out something original. It's always original.
Yes. Well, that's a little teaser for that in the future. We'll see you next time.
Okay, yeah, see you next time. Check out Ignorance.